The rain hammered against the cracked windshield of the old pickup truck as it crawled through the industrial outskirts of town. In the passenger seat, 15-year-old Maya pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the abandoned warehouses blur past like forgotten dreams. Her younger brother, 12-year-old Derek, sat between her and their father, clutching a worn backpack that contained everything he owned in the world. Their father, Thomas, gripped the steering wheel with calloused hands, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was trying not to show how scared he really was. 3 days ago, they had been evicted from their apartment. 2 days ago, they had spent their last night in the truck. Today, they were driving toward what Thomas kept calling their new beginning, though his voice cracked when he said it. The Quonset hut appeared through the downpour like a beached metal whale. It sat at the end of a muddy gravel road, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted equipment that previous owners had abandoned. The curved, corrugated steel structure was maybe 40 feet long, with patches of rust blooming across its surface like oxidized flowers. One of the large doors hung crooked on its hinges, and several panels had buckled from years of neglect. Thomas killed the engine, and they sat in silence, staring at what $10 had bought them. $10 was all he had been able to scrape together after paying off their final debts, and the old farmer who owned the property had taken it with a sympathetic shake of his head and a warning that the building was sold as is, no guarantees, probably should be torn down anyway. Maya was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet but steady, the same voice she had used when their mother left 2 years ago, the same voice she had used when they got the eviction notice. She had become good at being steady when everything else was falling apart. She told her father that it had a roof, or most of one anyway. That was more than they had yesterday. Derek said nothing. He was staring at the building with wide eyes, and Maya could not tell if what she saw there was fear or something else entirely. Her brother had always been the dreamer of the family, the one who could find magic in empty lots and adventure in alleyways. She hoped that particular gift had not been beaten out of him by the last few months of uncertainty. Thomas opened his door, and cold rain immediately invaded the truck's cabin. He told them to wait while he checked it out, but Maya was already opening her door too. They were in this together, she said. They had been in everything together since Mom left. They would see their new home together. The three of them splashed through puddles toward the crooked door. Thomas had to put his shoulder into it to force it open wide enough for them to slip through. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound like something dying, and then they were inside. The interior was dim and cavernous, lit only by the grey light filtering through dirty windows set high in the curved walls. The concrete floor was cracked and stained with oil and things Maya did not want to identify. Old tires were stacked in one corner, broken pallets leaned against the walls, bird droppings decorated every surface, and the air smelled of rust, mildew, and decay, but it was dry, mostly. There were a few places where rain dripped through holes in the roof, but most of the structure was sound, and it was theirs. For $10, they owned something again. Derek walked to the center of the space and turned slowly in a circle, his footsteps echoing. He said it was huge. His voice carried the first hint of excitement Maya had heard from him in weeks. He said they could put beds on one side and maybe build a little kitchen area on the other. There was even electricity, he pointed out, gesturing to the conduit running along the walls, though whether it actually worked was another question entirely. Thomas was already walking the perimeter, examining the structure with the critical eye of a man who had worked construction before the economy collapsed and took his job with it. He ran his hands over the steel ribs, testing for give, for weakness. He crouched to examine the foundation. Maya watched him work and saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was adding up everything they would need to make this place livable, comparing it against the nothing they had in their pockets, and trying to figure out how to make the math work. Maya left them to their inspection and walked to the far end of the building. Here someone had built a small room, probably an office once. The door was missing, but the walls were intact, and there was even a window, though the glass was so dirty it barely let light through. She stepped inside and immediately felt something shift in her chest. This could be her room, a room with a door, with walls, with privacy. It was tiny, barely big enough for a mattress, but it would be hers. She heard Derek calling her name and went back to find him standing beneath one of the leaks, his face turned up to watch the water drip down. He was smiling. He told her he had an idea. What if they could catch the rainwater? They could use it for washing, maybe even for drinking if they boiled it. It would save money on the water bill. Thomas pointed out that they did not have money for a water bill anyway, which made Derek's idea less of a convenience and more of a necessity. But he was smiling too, just a little. Maya saw it in the corner of his mouth, that small upturn that meant he was beginning to think, maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. They spent the next hour exploring their new home, each of them silently taking inventory, making plans, seeing not what was, but what could be. Thomas found that the electrical panel was still functional, though he warned them they would have to be careful about how much they used. Derek discovered an old wood stove in one corner, rusty but intact, and declared they could heat the whole place with it if they could find wood. Maya counted the windows and calculated how much cardboard they would need to cover them until they could afford something better. When the rain finally stopped, they went back to the truck to retrieve their meager belongings. Everything they owned fit in 4 garbage bags and 2 cardboard boxes. Thomas carried in the cooler that held their food, 3 days' worth if they were careful. Derek brought in the camping lantern and the battery-powered radio. Maya took the bags of clothes and the box of books she had refused to leave behind, even when Thomas said they did not have room. They arranged everything in the center of the empty building. 3 sleeping bags, a small camp stove, a plastic bin of dishes and utensils, the food cooler, their bags of clothes, the radio, 2 flashlights, a first aid kit, a toolbox with a hammer, some screwdrivers, and a handful of nails. This was everything they had in the world, arranged on a cracked concrete floor in a rusting metal shell at the end of a muddy road. Night was falling. Thomas used some of their precious cash to buy sandwiches from a gas station down the road. They ate sitting on the floor in a circle, their voices echoing in the vast space. The camping lantern cast long shadows that climbed the curved walls and disappeared into darkness above. Derek asked what they were going to do tomorrow. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. Tomorrow, he said, they would start making this place home. He had some leads on day labor jobs. Maya could enroll herself and Derek in the school district. They would take it one day at a time, one problem at a time, one solution at a time. Maya asked how they were going to shower, and the question hung in the air, unanswered, because none of them knew. Derek suggested the school gym before classes started. Thomas mentioned that some churches offered shower facilities. They were quiet again, each of them understanding that they had crossed into a different category of poverty, one where basic human necessities required planning and creativity and a certain amount of shamelessness. That night, they lay in their sleeping bags on the hard concrete floor. The building creaked and groaned around them as it cooled, the metal contracting, producing sounds like the place was alive and breathing. Outside, an animal called in the darkness. The wind picked up and whistled through gaps in the walls. Maya stared up at the curved ceiling barely visible in the darkness and felt tears slide down her temples into her hair. She cried silently, not wanting her father or brother to hear, not wanting to add her despair to the weight they were already carrying. She was 15 years old and she lived in a shed. She had $10 worth of hope and an entire lifetime of problems pressing down on her chest like stones. But then Derek reached out in the darkness and found her hand, and she held on tight. The first morning came too early and too cold. Maya woke to the sound of her father already moving around, his footsteps echoing on the concrete as he tried to be quiet and failed. The temperature had dropped during the night, and her breath came out in visible puffs. She pulled the sleeping bag tighter around herself and watched through half-closed eyes as Thomas rummaged through their supplies, looking for something to make breakfast with. Derek was still asleep, curled into a tight ball, with only the top of his head visible. He had always been able to sleep through anything, a talent Maya envied. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles stiff from a night on the hard floor. Every part of her body ached, and she wondered how long it would take to get used to this, or if they ever would. Thomas noticed she was awake and gave her a tired smile. He had found a dented pot and was trying to heat water on the camp stove for instant oatmeal. It was all they had for breakfast, that and some granola bars Derek had gotten from the school cafeteria before they were evicted. Thomas told her good morning and asked how she slept, though they both knew the answer. She lied anyway and said fine, because what else was there to say? While the water heated, Maya walked to the small room she had claimed as her own. In the morning light filtering through the dirty window, it looked even smaller and more pathetic than it had yesterday. The walls were water-stained, and there were cobwebs in every corner. Someone had written something on one wall in faded marker, but it was too smudged to read. She stood in the center of the space and tried to imagine it as a bedroom, as a sanctuary, as something other than what it was. She heard Derek wake up with a startled gasp, the way he always did, as if sleep was something he had to fight his way out of. She went back to find him sitting up, looking around at the Quonset hut with confusion, before memory settled in and his shoulders slumped. Thomas was dividing the oatmeal into 3 bowls, carefully making sure each portion was exactly equal, though Maya noticed he had given himself slightly less. They ate without speaking much. The oatmeal was thin and tasteless, but it was warm, and that was something. Outside, they could hear traffic on a distant highway, a reminder that the normal world was still out there, still moving forward, still going about its business, while they huddled in their metal shell, trying to figure out how to survive. After breakfast, Thomas announced his plan for the day. He had 3 addresses for construction sites that might need day laborers. He would hit all of them, and if none of them panned out, he would go to the temp agency downtown. Maya's job was to get herself and Derek registered at the local school. He gave her $20 from his rapidly diminishing cash and told her to use it for lunch if they needed it, though his eyes said he hoped they would not need it because they needed it for so many other things. Maya and Derek walked the 2 miles to the school because the bus did not run out to their area, and they certainly could not afford to waste gas. The morning was bright and cold, and their breath steamed as they walked along the shoulder of the road. Derek kicked rocks and asked questions Maya did not have answers to. Would the kids at school make fun of them? Would the teachers be nice? What would they say when people asked where they lived? She told him they would figure it out, which was what she always said, and he seemed satisfied with that because he trusted her in a way that made her chest hurt. He believed she had answers, that she could fix things, that she could keep them safe. She did not tell him how terrified she was, how she lay awake at night cataloguing all the ways this could fall apart, how she sometimes caught herself doing math in her head, calculating how many meals they could miss before it became dangerous, how cold it could get before hypothermia became a real risk. The school was a sprawling brick building that had probably been modern in the 1970s, but now just looked tired. They found the main office and waited while a bored secretary finished a phone call. When she finally turned to them, Maya explained their situation in the carefully neutral voice she had perfected, the one that said they were poor but not pitiable, struggling but not helpless. They needed to enroll. They had just moved to the area. Yes, they had their previous school records. No, they did not have proof of residence yet because they were staying with family temporarily. The secretary's eyes said she had heard variations of this story 1,000 times. She handed them forms to fill out, and told them to have a seat. Maya filled out the papers while Derek sat beside her, swinging his legs, his feet not quite touching the floor. She put down the address of the Quonset hut and hoped no one would look too closely, would not realize it was zoned commercial, would not ask questions she did not want to answer. An hour later, they had temporary schedules and were being led through the halls by a student volunteer, a girl with perfect hair and expensive shoes who smiled too brightly and asked too many questions. Maya gave vague answers and kept her hand on Derek's shoulder, steering him through the crowded hallways. She could feel eyes on them, the new kids, the poor kids, the ones who did not quite fit. Derek's first class was science, and Maya walked him to the door, even though he insisted he did not need her to. She waited until he was inside, until she saw him take a seat at a table by himself, until the teacher started talking, and then she forced herself to walk away. Her own first class was English, and she slipped into a seat in the back, trying to be invisible, trying not to think about her brother sitting alone in a classroom full of strangers. The day passed in a blur of new faces and whispered conversations that stopped when she got too close. At lunch, she found Derek in the cafeteria, sitting by himself, picking at a free lunch tray. She sat down across from him, and he looked up with relief, so naked it made her want to cry. He told her about his classes, about the teacher who seemed nice and the one who seemed mean, about the kid who had asked him if he was homeless and how he had said no. They just moved, even though it felt like a lie. Maya did not tell him about the girls who had laughed when she walked past, about the teacher who had made her stand up and introduce herself to the class, about the way her stomach had cramped with hunger during third period because she'd given Derek most of her breakfast. She just listened and nodded and told him it would get easier, even though she was not sure she believed it. After school, they walked back to the Quonset hut together. The walk seemed longer than it had that morning, and Maya's feet hurt in her too small shoes. Derek was quiet, processing the day, and she let him be. Sometimes silence was better than false comfort. Thomas was already there when they arrived, and Maya knew immediately from his posture that the job search had not gone well. He was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the building, his shoulders rounded, his head down. When he heard them approaching, he looked up and tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. He told them one of the construction sites had hired him for tomorrow, just for one day, maybe more if they liked his work. It was something. It was $40 in their pockets if he worked the full 8 hours. Maya calculated quickly in her head. $40, minus gas to get there. That left maybe $35. They needed food, they needed water, they needed so many things that $35 felt like a joke. But Thomas was trying to be positive, trying to make it sound like a victory, so Maya smiled and said that was great. That was really great, Dad, and Derek high-fived him like they had won the lottery. They went inside and Thomas showed them what he had accomplished during the day. He had swept the floor, getting rid of the worst of the debris and bird droppings. He had covered the biggest leak in the roof with a tarp and some duct tape. He had tested the outlets and found that 3 of them actually worked. He had also brought back treasures from a dumpster behind a furniture store, 2 foam mattress pads that were stained but functional, a broken floor lamp that he thought he could fix, 3 plastic storage bins with cracked lids, a small folding table with wobbly legs. It was garbage that someone else had thrown away, but to them it was furniture, it was comfort, it was the difference between sleeping on concrete and sleeping on something slightly softer than concrete. They spent the evening arranging their new acquisitions, trying to make the space feel less like a warehouse and more like a home. Maya claimed one of the mattress pads for her small room. Derek and Thomas would share the other. They set up the folding table and used the storage bins as chairs. Thomas got the lamp working after 15 minutes of tinkering, and when he plugged it in and it actually lit up, they all cheered like he had performed a miracle. For dinner, they had ramen noodles cooked on the camp stove. Thomas let them each have 2 packets because it was their first full day in their new place, and he wanted it to feel like a celebration, even though Maya knew it meant they would run out of food faster. They ate sitting around the folding table, steam rising from their bowls, the single lamp casting a warm glow that almost made the place look cozy. Derek asked if they could get a dog. "Someday," Thomas said, "when they were more settled. When they had enough to feed themselves reliably, then they could think about a dog." Derek accepted this with a nod, already dreaming, already planning. Maya envied his ability to look forward, to imagine a future where things were better. She had lost that somewhere along the way, and she was not sure how to get it back. That night, lying on her mattress pad in her tiny room, Maya heard her father and brother talking in low voices in the main space. She could not make out the words, but she recognized the rhythms. Thomas was telling Derek a story, something about when he was young, something meant to be comforting. Derek's occasional laugh drifted through the doorless opening, and Maya closed her eyes and tried to hold on to that sound, tried to remember that they still had this. They still had each other. But sleep would not come. She lay in the darkness and listened to the building settle, to the wind outside, to the sound of a train passing somewhere in the distance. She thought about the girls at school, about the way they had looked at her clothes, her shoes, her hair. She thought about the lies she had told on the enrollment forms. She thought about what would happen if someone found out, if someone reported them, if they got taken away from their father. She thought about her mother, wherever she was, and wondered if she ever thought about them. Probably not. Her mother had made her choice when she got in that car with her new boyfriend and drove away without looking back. Maya had stopped expecting her to come back, stopped hoping, but she had not stopped hurting, and she suspected she never would. Through the wall, she heard her father's voice stop, heard Derek's breathing even out into sleep. She heard Thomas moving around quietly, probably checking the doors, checking the windows, checking on his children. She heard him pause outside her room, heard him hesitate as if he wanted to come in, wanted to say something, but he did not. After a moment, his footsteps moved away. Maya pulled her sleeping bag up over her head and finally let herself cry. The days began to blend together into a rhythm that was equal parts routine and survival. Thomas left before dawn most mornings, chasing day labor jobs that sometimes materialized and sometimes evaporated like morning fog. Maya and Derek walked to school, their shoes wearing thinner with each mile, their stomachs often empty because breakfast had become a luxury they could not always afford. They came home to the Quonset hut as the sun set, did homework by the light of the salvaged lamp, and ate whatever Thomas had managed to scrape together for dinner. By the end of the second week, they had made small improvements to their metal home. Thomas had found sheets of plywood behind a demolished house and built a crude door for Maya's room. It did not lock, and it hung crooked, but it gave her privacy, and that felt like wealth. Derek had collected empty bottles and cans from along the roadside, cashing them in for enough money to buy a cheap shower curtain that they hung as a divider, creating a small bathroom area around the utility sink Thomas had discovered, hidden beneath years of grime. The shower situation remained their biggest challenge. They had worked out a system of sorts. Thomas showered at a truck stop when he could afford the fee. Maya and Derek used the gym facilities at school, arriving early and leaving late, stretching out their time in the building where it was warm and there was running water, and for a few hours they could pretend they were normal kids with normal lives. Maya had started to recognize the other students who lingered at school the same way they did. There was a senior boy who always stayed until the janitor kicked him out, doing homework in the library with an intensity that suggested he had nowhere better to be. There was a sophomore girl who showered after every gym class, even when she had not participated, her hair always wet when she finally left the building. They never spoke to each other, these students who stayed too long, But there was a recognition in their eyes when they passed in the halls, an unspoken understanding of what it meant to be grateful for institutions that others took for granted. Derek was adapting in the way children do, with the resilience that both amazed and broke Maya's heart. He had made a friend, a boy named Marcus, who lived in the trailer park near the school and who did not ask questions about where Derek lived or why his clothes were always the same. They ate lunch together, traded snacks, and Marcus had even invited Derek over to play video games, an invitation Derek had desperately wanted to accept, but had declined because he had no way to reciprocate, no home he could invite Marcus to in return. Maya had not made friends. She had built walls instead, perfected the art of being pleasant but distant, of smiling without inviting conversation, of existing in spaces without really inhabiting them. It was easier this way, she told herself. Friends asked questions. Friends wanted to come over. Friends eventually found out that you lived in a corrugated metal building with no heat and no shower and no future, and then they either pitied you or abandoned you, and she could not decide which would be worse. But there was a boy. There was always a boy, was there not? His name was Jesse, and he sat 2 rows over in her English class. He had asked her for a pencil on the 3rd day, and she had given him one she could not really spare. He had returned it the next day with a candy bar as thanks, and she had wanted to refuse it, but the hunger in her stomach had overruled her pride. He smiled at her sometimes in the hallways. He had beautiful eyes and a laugh that made something in her chest feel warm and frightened all at once. She knew it was pointless. She knew she had nothing to offer, no time for the luxury of teenage romance when she was busy calculating how to make $3 stretch to feed 3 people. But she let herself look at him sometimes, when he was not watching, let herself imagine what it might be like to be a normal girl who could worry about normal things, like whether a boy liked her back, instead of whether they would have enough propane to cook dinner. 3 weeks into their new life, Thomas came home with news that made them all pause in the middle of their evening routine. He had been hired for a real job, not day labor, but an actual position with a small construction company. It was not full-time, not yet, but it was 3 days a week guaranteed with the possibility of more. It meant steady money, or steadier anyway. It meant they could start to plan beyond the next 24 hours. That night, Thomas used some of their carefully hoarded cash to buy a pizza. An extravagance so profound that Derek literally jumped up and down when he saw the box. They sat around their folding table and ate until their stomachs hurt, and for a little while the Quonset hut felt less like a prison and more like a home where good things could still happen. Maya watched her father and brother laugh over some joke she had missed, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp, and she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It took her a moment to identify it. Hope. It was small and fragile, and she did not quite trust it, but it was there, a tiny flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how hard the wind blew. But hope, Maya was learning, was a dangerous thing. It made you believe that things could get better, and that belief made it hurt so much more when they got worse instead. The trouble started small, the way trouble usually does. It started with a notice taped to the crooked door of the Quonset hut, a piece of paper that Thomas found when he came home from work one Thursday evening. Maya saw his face change as he read it, saw the color drain from his cheeks, saw his hands begin to shake. The property owner, the old farmer who had sold them the building for $10, had died. His son was settling the estate and had discovered the Quonset hut and its occupants. The notice informed them that they were trespassing on commercial property, that residential occupation was a violation of zoning ordinances, and that they had 2 weeks to vacate the premises or face legal action. 2 weeks, 14 days. They had 14 days to find somewhere else to go, and they had no money for a deposit on an apartment. No references, No rental history that did not end in eviction. Thomas read the notice 3 times, as if the words might change, might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and told Maya and Derek not to worry. He would figure something out. But Maya saw the lie in his eyes, and she knew Derek saw it too. There was nothing to figure out. They had nowhere to go. The Quonset hut was all they had, and now they were losing even that. That night, Maya could not sleep. She lay on her mattress pad and stared at the plywood door her father had built, and she thought about all the small improvements they had made, all the ways they had tried to turn this place into something livable. The shower curtain, the swept floors, the repaired lamp. They had put so much effort into making this work, and it had all been for nothing. She heard movement in the main space and got up to find her father sitting at the folding table, his head in his hands. When he looked up and saw her, he tried to smile, but it crumbled before it fully formed. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had tried so hard to keep them together, to give them something stable, and he had failed. His voice broke on the last word, and Maya went to him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and told him it was not his fault. None of this was his fault. But whose fault was it? Not her mother's, who had left them. Not the landlord who had evicted them, not the economy that had taken her father's job, not the system that made it impossible for people like them to get back on their feet once they fell. The blame went around and around like a carousel, and none of it changed the fundamental truth that in 2 weeks they would be homeless, truly homeless, with nowhere to go and no options left. Thomas told her he had been thinking. Maybe it would be better if she and Derek went to stay with their aunt in California. She had offered before, when their mother first left. She had a spare room. She could give them stability, proper beds, regular meals. Thomas could stay here, could work and save money, could get an apartment eventually and bring them back. It would just be temporary. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. She told him no. She told him they were staying together, that they would figure this out as a family, that she was not leaving him. He argued with her, told her to think about Derek, to think about what was best for her brother. She argued back, told him that what was best for Derek was to stay with his father, to stay with his sister, to not be separated from the only family he had left. Their voices rose, not quite yelling, but close. And then Derek appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. He asked what was happening, why they were fighting, and both Thomas and Maya stopped, stricken by the terror in his voice. Thomas told him to come here, and Derek ran to him, and they held each other, while Maya stood apart, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling like she was watching her family disintegrate in real time. Derek asked if they were leaving the Quonset hut, and Thomas told him the truth because he had always told them the truth, even when lies would have been kinder. Yes, they had to leave. Yes, they had to find somewhere else to go. No, he did not know where yet. But they would figure it out. They always figured it out. Except they did not always figure it out, did they? Sometimes there were no solutions. Sometimes you just fell and kept falling until you hit bottom. And sometimes there was no bottom, just endless falling forever. The next few days were tense and quiet. Thomas spent every spare moment on his phone, calling shelters, calling churches, calling anyone who might have resources for families in crisis. Maya listened to him explain their situation over and over, heard the desperation creep into his voice as each call ended with apologies and full beds and waiting lists that were months long. At school, Maya moved through her classes like a ghost. She could not focus on algebra or history or English literature when her entire life was collapsing. Jessie tried to talk to her once, asked if she was okay, and she snapped at him without meaning to, told him she was fine, and saw the hurt in his eyes before she walked away. She felt bad about it, but she could not deal with his kindness right now. Could not handle the weight of pretending everything was normal when nothing was normal and never would be again. Derek stopped eating. Not completely, but enough that Maya noticed, enough that she saw him push food around his plate and claim he was not hungry when she knew he was. When she confronted him, he admitted he was trying to save money, trying to help. She told him to eat his food, told him that was not his job, that he was 12 years old and should not have to worry about these things. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Of course he had to worry. They all had to worry. Worry was the air they breathed now. 1 week left, 7 days until they had to be out. Thomas came home and told them he had found a possibility. A shelter about 30 miles away had space for families, but there were conditions. They had a curfew. They had rules about belongings. They would have to share a room with other families. It was not ideal, Thomas said, but it was something. It was better than sleeping in the truck. Maya asked about school, and Thomas's face told her the answer before he spoke. They would have to transfer again. The shelter was in a different district. She and Derek would start over at new schools, make new attempts at fitting in, learn new hallways and new teachers and new ways to hide what they were. Derek asked quietly if they could take the lamp. Thomas said yes, they could take the lamp. They could take whatever fit in the truck. Everything else would have to stay behind. That night, Maya began mentally cataloguing what they would leave. The folding table, the storage bins, the plywood door, the shower curtain, all the small things they had gathered to make this place livable. They would abandon them for the next desperate family who found themselves with $10 and nowhere else to go. She lay in her room for what might be the last time and traced the water stains on the ceiling with her eyes. She had hated this place when they first arrived. She had cried herself to sleep on that first night, overwhelmed by the enormity of their fall. But somewhere along the way, it had become theirs. They had claimed it, improved it, survived in it, and now they had to let it go. Through the wall, she heard Derek crying, trying to muffle the sound in his pillow. She heard Thomas get up, heard him go to Derek, heard the low murmur of comfort that parents give children when there is no real comfort to be had. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about the future, about the shelter, about starting over again. She tried to focus on right now, this moment, this night, this room that was hers for just a little while longer. Tomorrow they would pack. Tomorrow they would prepare to leave. Tomorrow they would take another step down into uncertainty. But tonight they still had a roof over their heads, however temporary. Tonight they were still together. Tonight they still had hope, however false it might prove to be. Maya fell asleep, trying to believe that would be enough. The morning of their 5th day before eviction dawned grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the Quonset hut, like a heavy blanket. Maya woke to the sound of rain drumming against the metal roof, a sound that had become familiar over the past weeks, almost comforting in its consistency. But today it felt ominous, as if the sky itself was mourning what they were about to lose. She found Thomas already awake, sitting at the folding table with a notebook covered in numbers and crossed-out calculations. He had been trying to figure out the logistics of the move, trying to determine what they could fit in the truck, what they would need at the shelter, how to make their remaining money stretch to cover gas and food, and all the small expenses that added up to insurmountable totals. Maya made instant coffee on the camp stove, using the last of the grounds they had been rationing. She poured half into a chipped mug for her father and kept the rest for herself. Derek was still asleep, and she was grateful for that. Let him rest while he could, before the day demanded he wake up and face their reality again. Thomas thanked her for the coffee and showed her his calculations. If they were careful, if nothing unexpected happened, if the truck did not break down, and if they did not get sick, and if 1,000 other ifs aligned perfectly, they might have enough to make it to the shelter and survive the first week there. After that, it depended on whether his job would let him commute from 30 miles away, whether the shelter would let them stay long enough to save for a deposit on a new place, whether the universe would finally stop kicking them when they were down. Maya looked at the numbers. and felt the familiar weight settle on her chest. She had become fluent in the mathematics of poverty, could calculate in her head how many meals they could skip, how much they could earn from recycling, how far they could stretch $1 when they had to. It was a skill she had never wanted to learn, but she had become an expert anyway. Derek emerged from his sleeping bag looking small and tired. He'd lost weight over the past weeks, they all had, and his clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone bigger. He asked what was for breakfast, and Maya told him they had granola bars and the last of the milk that Thomas had bought 2 days ago. Derek nodded and said that sounded good, even though they all knew he was lying, even though granola bars and lukewarm milk was a sad excuse for a meal. They ate in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The rain continued its assault on the roof, and Maya found herself thinking about the leak they had patched with the tarp. She wondered if the next occupants would know to check it during storms, or if they would wake up to water dripping on their faces. She wondered if there would be next occupants, or if the farmer's son would just tear the whole building down, erase any evidence that they had ever tried to make a life here. After breakfast, Derek asked if they could do something special today, since they only had a few days left. He suggested they explore the woods behind the Quonset hut, an area they had never ventured into because they had been too busy surviving to think about adventure. Thomas looked like he wanted to say no, wanted to spend the day packing and planning, but then he saw the hope in Derek's eyes and agreed. They put on their jackets and walked out into the rain, which had softened to a drizzle. Behind the building, a narrow path led into a stand of trees that grew dense and wild. Derek ran ahead, jumping over puddles, and for a moment he looked like a normal kid, not a child who was about to lose his home for the second time in as many months. The woods were quiet, except for the drip of water from the leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Maya walked beside her father, their shoes squelching in the mud, and tried to remember the last time they had done something just for the sake of doing it, just for the pleasure of being together without the weight of necessity pressing down on them. Derek found a creek swollen with rainwater, rushing over rocks and fallen branches. He crouched beside it and watched the water flow with complete fascination. He said it was going somewhere, the water. It was going to a river and then to the ocean, and then it would evaporate and become clouds and come back as rain. It was a cycle, he said. Nothing was ever really lost, it just changed form. Maya wanted to tell him that was not how it worked for people, that when they lost things they stayed lost, that there was no cycle that would bring back their apartment or their old life or their mother. But she could not bring herself to ruin this moment, could not shatter whatever comfort he was finding in the idea that loss might be temporary, that transformation might be possible. Thomas sat down on a fallen log and patted the space beside him. Maya and Derek joined him, and they sat together watching the creek rush past. Thomas told them a story about when he was a kid, about how his father had taken him camping and they had gotten lost in the woods for a whole night. He had been terrified, certain they would never find their way back, but his father had stayed calm, had made a fire, had told stories until morning came and they could see the path again. Derek asked if they ever found their way back, and Thomas laughed and said obviously they did. He was here, was he not? But the point of the story was not about being lost. It was about having someone with you who refused to panic, who believed they would find a way through even when the path was not clear. That was what family was for, Thomas said, to be the calm in the storm, to believe in the way forward even when you could not see it yet. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted to believe her father, wanted to have his faith that they would find their way through this. But she had seen the numbers in his notebook, had heard the desperation in his voice when he called the shelters. She knew the odds were not in their favor, knew that belief alone could not put food on the table or a roof over their heads. They stayed by the creek for over an hour, none of them wanting to go back to the reality waiting for them at the Quonset hut. But eventually the cold drove them back, their clothes damp and their fingers numb. As they walked through the trees, Derek asked his father if they could come back here someday, after they got settled somewhere new. Thomas said yes, of course they could. Promises he could not keep, Maya thought. More hope built on nothing but wishes. Back at the building, they found something that stopped them all in their tracks. Someone had left boxes by the door, 4 cardboard boxes filled with canned goods, rice, pasta, and other non-perishable food. There was a note taped to one of the boxes, written in shaky handwriting that said only, "Heard you could use this. God bless." Thomas stood staring at the boxes like he could not quite believe they were real. Derek immediately started going through them, listing off the contents with growing excitement. Soup, tuna, beans, peanut butter, crackers, cereal. It was more food than they had seen in one place since before the eviction. Maya picked up the note and read it again, trying to understand. Who had left this? Who even knew they were here? They had been so careful to keep to themselves, to not attract attention. But someone had noticed, someone had cared enough to help. Thomas carried the boxes inside one by one, his movements careful, almost reverent. He lined them up against the wall, and then he sat down on the floor and put his face in his hands. Maya thought he was crying, but when he looked up his eyes were dry, just tired, so tired. He said they had to find out who left this, had to thank them. Derek said maybe it was an angel. Maya said angels did not shop at grocery stores, but Thomas said maybe they did. Maybe that was exactly what angels did. That night, they had a feast by their standards. Thomas cooked pasta on the camp stove with canned tomato sauce, and they ate until their stomachs were full for the first time in days. Derek talked non-stop about the woods, about the creek, about how when they got their own place someday, they should make sure it was near trees and water. Thomas humored him, agreed that yes, trees and water would be nice, and Maya tried to participate in the fantasy, but found she could not quite manage it. After dinner, while Derek was brushing his teeth at the utility sink, Thomas told Maya he thought he knew who had left the food. There was a woman at his job site, the owner's wife, who sometimes brought lunch for the crew. She had asked him once if he had kids, and he had told her about Maya and Derek. She must have put it together, must have realized they were struggling. Thomas said he would thank her tomorrow, would tell her how much it meant. Maya asked if he was embarrassed, if it bothered him that someone had figured out how desperate they were. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said he used to be embarrassed, used to feel shame every time they had to accept help.